Giving this opportunity, I also would like to have a very quick introduction to namespaces. You have noticed that standard library object cout, character output, character input, and other parts of the library are all prefixed by std : so they're actually set to be contained inside standard library namespace. So let's talk a little bit about namespaces. I can do something like this. I can type, look, inside my header file, I can say namespace serial date, and look at the opening brace, right, curly brace right here, and then somewhere down here we would want to close the brace, and you can see it corresponds to this namespace. So sometimes you can even provide a comment like this, that this is the ending of our namespace, and we can even indent these function declarations in this namespace like this. So what this namespace really does, it really doesn't change any algorithms, any computation or anything. It just provides additional means for program organization. And the reason is that sometimes you want to use the names that may be in collision with other libraries, like standard library or some other parts of the program. So in other words, namespaces allow you to isolate these function names, these identifiers, into or encapsulate them into a single namespace. So what happens next is that now, because you decided to use namespace and place your functions inside the namespace. By the way, this namespace topic is not a requirement of this homework, but you can use it if you want. So now we can go to our serial date CPP, and basically here the common practice is to, we can try either. Well, first of all, this is all unfinished, so let me make sure that I add my return statements to at least allow this code to compile. And with respect to namespaces, typical practice is just to reopen this namespace like this. Right, reopen this namespace and then close this namespace at the end of this file again. And essentially provide implementations of these functions inside this namespace, because they're being purposely placed inside the namespace other than global space. By the way, if functions are not in any sort of namespace, they're considered to be in global namespace. So here's the function, right? But now it's being placed inside the namespace, and I just need to I will, since this is all unfinished, right, I will just replace this by return 0, oops, like this, right? So I should be able to compile, and then if I call my, I don't want to divide by 0, by the way, so let's change it to 4. So this would be 1 if we try to run it. Okay, and in this demo, I make this call. So since my functions were deliberately placed inside this namespace, my direct option is to now I have to specify the name of the namespace in front of the function, because namespace combined with function name becomes now the real name for this function. You see, it's like every function name inside the namespace, automatically its name is extended by the name of the namespace, and so the two now have to be combined together to specify the name of this function, right? So this is an idea behind the namespace. So because now we can have these names in other namespaces, and they will not really, there will be no name collision. We realize that this function x comes from namespace A, and the same function x name could be coming from a namespace B, and there is no issue with their naming. So it allows us to combine libraries with predefined classes, functions, variable names, all sorts of things without worry about name collision. Because if we begin to experience name collision from different places, we can just say, oh, wait a minute, we can wrap our stuff inside the namespace and avoid this collision, because namespace very simply resolves any kind of conflicts in naming from different source files. Right, so this is part of our coverage in the current chapter of the textbook, so we can introduce this namespace here. Let me try to build this just to see if I can build this. I'm still missing something here. Yeah. So it complains that the variable is uninitialized, of course, because it was just a mock-up, and my compiler gives me an error. That's kind of nice, because variables better be initialized before they are used. So I'll just rebuild this. Okay, so you see that everything builds fine. So this is just a shell, empty shell that does nothing. Another option to define functions for namespaces would actually be to take, I'll use one of these examples here, syntactically, you can take this function out of here and provide its full name in its implementation like this, right? So if I rebuild this one more time, you see that it's the same way. But I would say that most of the time when you have a dedicated file with implementation for your functions and you're wrapping your functions inside the namespace, the most typical approach would be to define functions inside namespaces. Here we remove this namespace qualifier, and then we can use it like this, right? So that's a very typical approach, but both can be used. Both outside of the namespace and inside the namespace. By the way, I'm not limited to have only one source files, for one source file to implement these functions. I could implement each function in a separate source file. I could add 3 more source files and move things around. So namespaces can be reopened again in all of the source files. It's not a problem. And there you can follow the same technique to place your functions inside the namespace, provide the solution, what the function does, and organize your program like this. So therefore, when we use character output device or object that represents its character output device with standard library namespace in front of it, you can realize that this is very likely the same technique, namespace, std, and then the definition of cout is placed inside that namespace, and therefore we use it like this. If you don't like these long names like that, you can simply say using namespace serial date in our case, right? Serial date, and then we don't need to use this syntax, and we just simply call our function. So therefore, if this function is not found anywhere in global namespace, which means without namespace, then compiler will attempt to look inside serial date namespace, and sure enough, here's this function defined inside namespace, so this name will be resolved just fine. So once again, I build it just to verify that my syntax still holds correctly. And by the way, the using declaration, which is what I'm doing right now, it doesn't have to be in front of, like using entire global space. You can declare, you can say using namespace inside functions. So then this using declaration is only covering the internals of this function. or you can you place it right before you use it, or something like this, right? So just don't be under impression that using namespace declaration is limited only to places like this. In global space, you declare it. So just a few notes like that, but typically inside your source file you can keep it here. All right, so these are all the issues concerning namespaces and their syntax, and it's an extremely simple organizational part of the language, and very, very effective way to organize things, package things inside namespaces, and they should have logical names.